Well, thank you very much for having me. Okay, so the paper I'm going to talk about today is called Advertising and Self-Persuasion. And this paper is, one of the questions this paper is asking is, how does advertising work? And also, I think it's reasonable that we ask, why should we care? So approximately $750 billion is spent globally on advertising. Clearly, not all of it provides hard information, but we still don't understand how non-informative advertising works. Now, there is a theory about non-informative advertising. The leading theory is about 50 years old now. It was developed by Philip Nelson. And essentially, the idea is that, okay, so if consumers are rational, why should anything that's not information matter? Well, because even non-informative advertising provides some information. It provides information that the product is advertised and that somebody thought there had enough quality for a company to spend a lot of money on it. So think about watching a Super Bowl ad. I think, obviously the ads are entertaining, but also we're just kind of in awe that somebody would spend millions of dollars to advertise this beer on the Super Bowl. And so I think that, the thinking is that consumers take away this, thing is like, well, wow. I mean, if Budweiser is advertised on the Super Bowl, if they spent that much money on it, it must be worthy of note. Okay, so, or to put it, we seem to be, okay, let's back up here a little bit. It must be worthy of note. So sort of put more formally, it must be of high quality. Okay, so we infer from a lot of expenditure that a product is of high quality. But if that's the case, if all we're doing is looking at the amount that's spent on the advertising, then why do firms spend a lot of money on crafting the message and the image in the ads? Why are they hiring advertising agencies to create this content along with spending the money to place the ad? Okay, so it seems that somebody thinks that they're actually persuading consumers in some fashion. And yet, again, economists have no model for this because we think a rational consumer could not possibly be persuaded. So, so really nothing has progressed very much in past 50 years with regard to this theory. And so what we see is most empirical work and existing theoretical work posits just very simply that non-informative advertising increases the targeted consumer's willingness to pay without specifying how that happens. So in other words, there's this idea that, okay, advertising targets a certain person and that person's willingness to pay for the product will be increased. We don't know how, but we assume that's how it works. But I think it's reasonable for us to ask, can empirical work based upon such agnosticism accurately predict the price effects of advertising? So this paper asks that question, but in addition, it proposes a new theory of how persuasive advertising actually works, that it assists consumers in persuading themselves. And so consistent with some previous published papers of mine, I posit a consumer who makes choices and simultaneously invests effort to increase her utility from the choices she makes. So she's doing two things at the same time. One thing is she's making a choice. She's also deciding how much effort to invest in increasing her utility. And through effort, she can actually increase her utility from the choices she makes. So you may wonder, so how is this possible? How is it possible for me to through effort, make myself like something better? It's based upon a theory of bounded rationality, in line with a model by Kosegi and Seidel called focused weighted utility. And the idea is that the way we feel about a product, our attitudes towards products are not based upon all of the characteristics of the products because we just can't keep all of those in our head. There's only certain things that are top of mind about a product. Certain things stick. And so it's possible for a consumer to decide what to focus on about a product, to focus on certain characteristics but not others, and therefore influence the top of mind information about the product and influence how she feels or he feels about that product. And so you could actually influence the utility that you get from things by how you think about them. And there's, in fact, psychological evidence, much of it from a while ago, that top of mind phenomena dominate attitudes. And so a consumer who knows that she is capable of doing this knows that she will self-persuade and makes her choices accordingly. Advertising in this context, according to my theory, provides the persuasive ammunition that consumers need to get optimally psyched up about the products they're going to choose. Okay, so what additional evidence do we have for this sort of a model? There is a lot of recent evidence from psychology that people increase their ratings of their chosen alternatives actually in the process of making choices. So we've have in a number of these studies, consumers are asked before they make a choice to rate certain products, and they're asked afterwards. And what happens is after they've made a choice, after they've committed to a particular choice, the ratings of that choice increase. Okay, so it's almost as if they've decided to like it more. And we also have, very interestingly, evidence from fMRI studies, from brain scans, that show that there is preference-related brain activity accompanying the choice process. So at the moment at which consumers are making choices, the area of their brain related to preferences is very active, suggesting that consumers are actually actively altering, basically, changing their preferences as they make choices. And very recently, there is some very interesting evidence that that choice-induced preference change is actually integral to the decision process, which is to say, it's not just what you might think and what had been believed for a long time, post hoc justification. Okay, so I guess the traditional theory, psychological theory about these things is that when a person makes a choice, they try to reduce their dissonance with regard to that choice. You've made a decision, you want to be sure that you're committed to the decision, so we tend to change our attitudes post hoc so that we don't feel cognitive dissonance. And yet, the recent evidence is that it's not just post hoc justification, but that consumers are actually changing their preferences that in the process of making the decision. It's integral to the decision process, as if it's part of an optimizing process. Evidence on advertising suggests that it is actively used by consumers to shift their preferences when they commit to a choice. And more specifically, message content is recruited selectively to support and reinforce existing preference positions. Okay, so to preview my results, I find that advertising's effect on prices depends in part on who is targeted by the advertising. This is what I call a shaping effect. And this is actually consistent with the prior literature that assumes that advertising affects prices through its effect in increasing the targeted consumer's willingness to pay. So this is sort of the standard theory, is in line with one part of one of the implications of my model. However, my model also shows that advertising's effect depends additionally on its further manifestation of the pre-advertising pattern of self-persuasion capabilities. And this happens because the pattern of differences in the costs of self-persuasion across consumers influences prices. And so further manifestation of this pattern increases the existing pattern's influence on prices. So you've got two effects. And empirics that are based on the willingness to pay hypothesis alone, that it will therefore ignore the second effect, and so have the potential to make erroneous predictions about the effect of advertising on prices. And sort of an analogy for understanding why this is the case, why this represents a problem for existing empirical work, is the problem of predicting the price effects of a public policy. Consider, for example, a college savings program, okay? A program that is introduced, that basically introduces tax-deferred college savings plans. And these plans are available to everybody. They're targeted towards poorer people, because the purpose of this program is to get people going to college who couldn't have afforded it, but they're open to everybody, okay? So now suppose that rich people have a greater marginal propensity to take advantage of any new college savings opportunities. So it might be the case that even though the college saving program is targeted at poorer people, that the effect is actually to increase the income stratification of college savings. Why? Because one component of the effect is to further manifest an existing relative proclivity of rich people to adopt these opportunities. Okay, and so that sort of is, I think, analogous to what I suggest may be happening with advertising, and may, in fact, make the predictions of that advertising influences price based on targeting certain consumers. That may cause some errors for that sort of prediction. Okay, so let me introduce you to the model. The model is based upon a standard hoteling framework, and so most of you have probably heard of the hoteling model of differentiated product competition. And so, sort of the standard that you have here is you've got two firms located at either end of a segment of unit length. Consumers are distributed on the segment. Their locations on the segment represent their relative preference for the two products. Consumers that are closer to one end of the segment have a relative preference for the firm at that end of the segment, okay? And so the consumers are not distributed uniformly on the segment, they're distributed uniformly on a subsegment of this segment, but it's a symmetric subsegment. And the baseline utility of a consumer at X is given by the formula that you see here. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can actually, if you set new equal to 0, get the full segment. But the reason I have the subsegment here is because there are certain issues with certain parameters in the model that can cause there not to be a unique equilibrium, and so there's sort of a tension between the value of the new and other values of the parameters in the model that allow for different values of these other parameters for new to adjust, so that there are certain other conditions under which unique equilibrium will occur. Okay, so it's not restrictive, it's just saying it's conditional. Okay, we condition on this possibility that the segment may be of different sizes, and that allows actually all of the results to occur under the model. Okay, but it's not restrictive because, again, we can allow new to be 0 and to get the full segment that we're used to. Okay, but actually, intuitively, what does it represent? It represents the possibility that consumers are more dispersed, or they're more concentrated towards the center. Okay, so we're allowing based upon the value of new to vary the degree to which consumers are concentrated towards the center. Okay.
It doesn't say anything about the product.
No, I mean, it just says the distribution of preferences with regard to the product is either going to be more concentrated or more dispersed, more evenly spread out. So we're actually allowing. It's a generalization. You can think of it as a generalization of the normal hoteling framework of uniformly distributed consumers. Okay, so this is where we start from. This is more standard hoteling, except for that this new allows us to generalize slightly from that. Okay, and so this is, of course, you've probably seen pictures like this before. Okay, so a consumer located at X is going to incur a disutility, okay, from consuming either product, because neither of these products is her ideal. And the disutility from consuming a product that is not your ideal is represented in this unit transportation cost T. And so if you're located at position X, you're going to incur a cost TX from consuming the product at location 0, and T times 1 minus X for the product at location 1. Okay, and that's just because. And so if X was closer to 0, the consumer would get less disutility from that product because it's closer to her ideal preferences. Okay, so this is just sort of a standard hoteling setup. So on top of this, I layer an additional critical assumption that the consumer is capable of self-persuading. Think of this as relocating on the segment, okay? And so by moving closer to one of the products, you reduce the amount of transportation cost and disutility that you get, okay? Because you basically persuade yourself that this is more closer to your ideal. However, that in itself is costly, and the cost of that relocation is embodied in the marginal self-persuasion cost, or MSPC function, that I present here. So let's take a look at what this function is. So here you'll see advertising for the product J, AJ, appears, and there's a function phi that is increasing in ranges from 0 to 1. Okay, so if you look at this, what you're going to see is that this function is a sum of two weighted component functions, okay, where phi aj and 1 minus phi aj are the weights. The component functions are gj1 and gj0. And so what you can see is that when there's no advertising, the consumer's MSPC is gj0, and when advertising approaches infinity, it converges towards gj1. Okay, so we sort of have a post-advertising function, a pre-advertising function. And so advertising is essentially causing the MSPC to converge asymptotically from gj0 to gj1. And we make the additional assumption that gj1 is strictly less than gj0. So advertising strictly reduces self-persuasion costs. Also, I just point out that the G function is a function of two variables, X and I. X is the consumer's location, so we allow self-persuasion cost to vary with the relative strength of the consumer's preference. And we also allow it to vary with how much they have already self-persuaded. So if you've begun self-persuading, you're at I equals 0, but as you progress, I increases, you're getting close, persuading yourself even more and more, getting, more to where you're at the position of the product. And as you go, that cost can change, okay? And specifically, I presume that the GJK are convex. So in other words, self-persuasion is easy initially, but it grows harder as one continues moving closer to J, okay? All right, and so graphically, this is what the overlay looks like. On top of the hoteling model, we have these convex functional curves where the one that you see is this, oh, no, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, I was trying to, how do I actually, there we go, there's my laser pointer. But I seem to have, okay, I can probably still work with this. Anyway, so the consumer at X is going to have this curve as its marginal self-persuasion cost for product 1, this one for product 0, and you can see what happens as the consumer relocates closer and closer to the product, the cost goes up, and it's initially lower than the transportation cost, so it behooves the consumer to do some self-persuasion. But then as you move along, it gets relatively costly, and so the consumer, you can see what's going to happen. There's going to be sort of an optimal amount of self-persuasion. We'll talk about that in a bit. Okay. So I proposed a specific parameterization for this function, and the purpose of this parameterization, which introduces parameters sigma 0, sigma 1, theta, and b, okay, which the first 3 of them are greater than or equal to 0, b is strictly greater than 0. The purpose of this is to capture parametrically concepts of targeting, okay, to capture advertising that might be targeted versus advertising that might be what we might call mass market advertising. Okay, so the parameters sigma 0 and sigma 1 give the relative advantage of self-persuasion for zealous or relatively strong preference consumers. 0 would represent pre-advertising advantage of self-persuasion, and 1 post-advertising, so sigma 0 and sigma 1. In this context, sigma 1 minus sigma 0 measures the effect of targeted advertising. And so if it's greater than 0, we're measuring advertising that targets zealous consumers that influences their relative capabilities of self-persuasion more than indifferent consumers. And if this is less than 0, the advertising is in effect targeting indifferent consumers. Okay, so we're able to represent different types of advertising here, advertising that targets relatively indifferent consumers versus advertising that targets inframarginal or very strong preference consumers. And theta here is going to represent advertising that reduces everybody's self-persuasion costs across the board equally. And so we think of that as mass market advertising. Okay, and so it helps to look at some pictures here. So here we have a map showing MSPC curves for a situation where, and this corresponds to sigma 0 and equals 0 or sigma 1 equals 0, depending upon whether this is a pre or post advertising map. But what we see here is MSPC curves where indifferent consumers are the strongest at self-persuasion. And what you can see is their self-persuasion costs start really low, and whereas the ones for very strong preference consumers are rising very steeply. And so what you have is, as everybody self-persuades, you have convergence. Preferences tend to converge. I refer to this regime as mean regressive, okay, because self-persuasion favors the relatively indifferent consumers, and that corresponds to, again, to the parameter values sigma 0 or sigma 1 equal to 0. This map, now notice the differences here. Here we have them all starting at the same level. If instead you have the self-persuasion curves for relatively zealous consumers starting lower, they in effect have a head start. So they have a relative advantage of self-persuasion compared to the previous map. And so what we have, and this corresponds to sigma 0 greater than 0 or sigma 1 greater than 0. Here, zealous consumers have relatively greater strength at self-persuasion. And so preferences converge less through self-persuasion under this regime. Okay, so a few other words about the parameterization. It naturally ensures a self-persuasion map based upon what we've already shown you without any further restrictions. It naturally ensures a self-persuasion map with non-crossing nested contours like a well-behaved indifference map. Some additional assumptions I make, shown here. The first one ensures that advertising does not increase self-persuasion costs, which I think is a reasonable assumption. Advertising is only going to make self-persuasion easier. The second assumption ensures positive costs of self-persuasion both before and after advertising. They're not going to become zero or negative. And then the last one is also, I'm not going to break it down for you, but it's not a restrictive assumption, actually. It just, what it does is it relates, this is what I was referring to, Christos. This is relating the values of new to the values of other parameters in the model, and it ensures that we have a unique equilibrium in finite prices. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned, it's going to be clear that in this situation, a certain consumer is going to do a certain amount of optimal amount of self-persuasion that they're going to decide upon. And so to represent that concept, I define this term self-persuasion capital as how much attitude improvement the consumer attains via self-persuasion. We're not going to go through all this set notation, but just say that given the parameterization of the model, we can actually explicitly solve for the amount of self-persuasion that the consumer will do given her location and the amount of advertising. Okay. And so here we have graphically sort of a representation of that. You can see that a consumer located at X is going to self-persuade, and then up to this point where the marginal self-persuasion cost exactly equals the marginal transportation cost. At that point, the consumer says, hey, from here, just trying to work harder at talking myself into this product isn't worth it. I'm just going to suck it up and deal with the fact that this is not my ideal product from here. And this is about as much self-persuasion as I want to do. Okay. And so we represent that with I star 0 for product 0, I star 1 for product 1. I want to point out here that the consumer is not persuading themselves with respect to both products. The consumer is just aware of how much self-persuasion they can do and how much they'll want to do if they choose that product. If the consumer is thinking, it seems to me like product 0 is the best choice, then they engage in the self-persuasion for that product and they go forward with that product. So it's only going to persuade yourself with respect to the product that you're going to choose. Again, these are done simultaneously. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. So accounting for self-persuasion, we have a slight complication in the hoteling utility. We have an additional term. So utility now incorporates transportation cost term, but also a self-persuasion cost component. And this expression that you see here is going to reduce to the hoteling utility if I star is equal to 0. Yes, Christos.
Why both are needed if I'm only dealing with one?
Yeah.
If I have decided to go, how both are needed in your book?
Yeah.
If I decided to go with one or the other.
Well, you're making that decision actively, okay? And I'm going to talk about how that decision is made. So what we're trying to do here is just examine the consumer's decision, but the consumer is deciding actively between the two, and at the same time recognizing, hey, if I go with this one product, I'm going to have to persuade myself with respect to this product so that I feel more comfortable with it. I'm going to do that optimally. And if I do this other product, I'm going to engage in self-persuasion with respect to that product and do that optimally. And so, that's worked into the decision. It's incorporated into the decision. Okay. So anyway, this is the utility of the consumer for product 0, and there's a similar expression for product 1. Okay, and so this here we have a representation of the cost components when the consumer self-persuades with respect to a product. And so, ordinarily, if there was no self-persuasion, the consumer would incur a transportation cost equal to the size of this rectangle, T times X, right? Okay, but because of self-persuasion, instead, up to this point, we take the integral under the self-persuasion curve. Okay, and so you can see that less cost is incurred when you self-persuade. Self-persuading is better than not self-persuading. It's actually rational to self-persuade. Okay, the consumer wants to do this. It improves the consumer's surplus, it increases welfare for consumers to persuade themselves in my model. Okay. Okay, last assumption that I make is an assumption that implies that the market is covered in equilibrium. It's essentially just a restriction on the reservation utility that it be large enough for all consumers so that there are no consumers that choose to go with an outside option. Consumers will all choose between these two products. This is actually a variant on an assumption by Bloch and Monceau from a 1999 paper. but adapted to the self-persuasion context. And following from this, since we know that all consumers are going to choose between product 0 and product 1, we know that there is a single location where there is an indifferent consumer, and that to the left of that consumer, all consumers will choose product 0, and to the right, all consumers will choose product 1. And that location is defined implicitly by this expression here. And based upon this expression and the value of xi, which is the location of the indifferent consumer, the market shares of the firms come out as shown here. D0 is the market share of firm 0, and it's xi minus nu divided by 1 minus 2 nu. And for firm 1, it's 1 minus xi minus nu over 1 minus 2 nu. Okay. So we have explicit expressions for the market shares of the firms. All right, so everything we've talked about so far is all consumer assumptions. Now we turn over to the firms. The assumption's not as complicated for the firms. We just assume 2 periods of play between the 2 firms. In first period, firms choose advertising expenditures, taking each other's advertising expenditure choices as given. In the second period, period 2, the firms choose prices, taking each other's prices and their previous advertising choices as given. Firms recognize that their prices and rivals' prices will depend on prior advertising choices, and so treat these strategically at t equals 1. I seek the subgame perfect Nash equilibrium for this game, and the firm's profits can be written as shown here using the market shares. The last term that you see in each of these profit expressions is the cost of advertising. I assume a unit cost of advertising of little a. Okay, so now the results. First result is uniqueness result, okay? I derive a unique equilibrium result so that on the basis of that, we can then do comparative statics to talk about the effect of advertising on prices. Okay, so the uniqueness of the equilibrium follows from the existing setup. Only concavity of phi is necessary as an additional condition to ensure the uniqueness of each firm's optimizing advertising level. And so if phi is sufficiently concave, remember the phi function is the advertising function, okay? So as advertising goes up, there's going to be this kind of convergence towards 1 that's going to weight this self-persuasion function. So we're just requiring phi to be sufficiently concave. But if phi is sufficiently concave, then there exists a unique pure strategy Nash equilibrium in which prices are equal and they take the form shown here. Okay, so we have an explicit form for the prices that are charged by the firms. We know that advertising is strictly non-negative and that the indifferent consumer is located right in the middle. Why? This is a completely symmetric model, okay? And so all the assumptions we made are symmetric. We're doing that just to simplify so we don't have to worry about differences between the firms and we can observe the effects that we're interested in, okay? But the symmetry of the equilibrium follows from the existing setup. All right, so effect of advertising on price can be calculated now by differentiating the expression for price in proposition 1 with respect to own advertising level, and we get this very neat expression here for whether advertising increases price. So advertising increases prices if the expression that you see here is greater than 0 and decreases if the inequality is reversed. So let's talk about this expression. The expression has 2 terms. Okay, so proposition 2 shows that advertising affects prices via the weighted sum of 2 component effects. The first effect, the first term, I call the shaping effect. And so you can see from looking at it that if this expression sigma 1 minus sigma 0 is greater than 0, we're going to get higher prices, all else equal. And if it's less than 0, we're going to get lower prices. It's weighted by T minus B, which is strictly positive, okay? So B is assumed in the model to be less than T, so it's strictly positive. All right, and so this works via advertising's relative facilitation of self-persuasion for certain consumers, whether indifferent consumers or zealous consumers. Remember that we mentioned that if this expression is positive, we're talking about targeting of inframarginal or zealous, strongly preferenced consumers, whereas this expression being negative would represent targeting of marginal or indifferent consumers. Okay, so this is an effect that flows from advertising being targeted in a certain way. The second component, okay, represented by the second term here, is what I call the manifestation effect. And So the sign of this derives from the expression in parentheses. If that expression is greater than 0, we get higher prices. If it's less than 0, we get lower prices. It's weighted by something that's strictly positive. Okay. And so this effect works via advertising's facilitation of self-persuasion equally across all consumers. The geometric intuition, okay, well, I didn't mention the geometric intuition of the first effect. Geometric intuition of the shaping effect is that advertising changes the shape of the self-persuasion map to become more or less mean regressive. The geometric intuition of the second effect is advertising further manifests the existing self-persuasion map. So let me talk a little bit more through some of that intuition. Okay, so an application, well, first of all, an application, what are we talking about? What does this all mean in the real world? Well, the shaping effect may be thought of as the effect of advertising targeting certain consumers, okay, whereby their effectiveness at self-persuasion is increased, holding others constant. The manifestation effect may be thought of the effect of mass market advertising that increases the self-persuasion effectiveness equally of all consumers. Okay, and so just taking a look at some pictures, advertising shaping effect can be thought of, see, we've got two sets of curves here. We have a gray set of curves, okay, represented sort of by this map that all kind of bottoms out there. And then we have this black set. And so think of the gray set as pre-advertising, the black one is post-advertising. So shaping effect represents a change in the shape of the self-persuasion map, if you will, okay? Here, what we're observing in this example is a self-persuasion map that's becoming less mean regressive. It's becoming more favorable to the zealous consumers, okay? So that is a shaping effect that we're seeing when the advertising is specifically targeting the more zealous consumers, okay? And here we see an example of the manifestation effect. And so here again, the gray map is the pre-advertising map, the black one is the post-advertising map. And what we're seeing is a situation where advertising targets everybody equally. And what it does is it reduces everybody's self-persuasion costs. It just pushes the map down uniformly across all consumers. And so what it does is it manifests more of the map. More of the map is now below T than was previously. And so the price effects implicit in the shape of the map are more expressed. Now we're going to talk about what those price effects are in a bit. Okay. Okay, so again, the key to both of these effects is that the shape of the self-persuasion map affects prices. When the curves begin at the same cost baseline, but grow more steeply towards the extremes, a more mean regressive pattern, a price increase moves to the margin consumers who are relatively less effective at self-persuasion. Okay, so just backing up 1 second here. All right, take a look at let's actually take a look. Yeah, actually, no, let's take a look at this one. Take a look at the gray map here, okay? So here's the indifferent consumer initially. If consumer 0 raises price, then what's going to happen is the position of the indifferent consumer is going to shift to the left. It's going to be somewhere over here, okay? Because this consumer was previously indifferent. Now, all else equal price, the price of product 0 goes up. Now this consumer prefers product 1. And so there's a new indifferent consumer further over. That consumer faces a steeper self-persuasion curve. So that consumer finds self-persuasion less effective. That consumer is less good at it, all right? And therefore, that consumer is more likely to switch products, okay? And because that consumer is more likely to switch, when the pattern is very mean regressive like that, we're going to see lower prices. On the other hand, when curves nearer the extremes begin at a lower cost baseline, all else equal, a less mean regressive pattern, a price increase moves to the margin consumers who are relatively more effective at self-persuasion compared to the other map. This means that they're going to be less likely to switch, and that's a pattern that is conducive to higher prices. So to summarize, the map that you see on the left here, the very mean regressive map, is going to be a situation with relatively lower prices. This will be one with relatively higher prices, because of it all has to do with the relative efficiency at self-persuasion of different consumers with different strengths of product preference, okay? So this is an effect on prices that had not been recognized and that appears under my model. Okay, so to summarize, the effect of advertising on prices is the sum of two effects: a shaping effect by which advertising will tend to raise prices if it shifts the adjustment map to be less mean regressive, lower prices if it shifts the map to be more mean regressive, and a manifestation effect by which advertising will tend to lower prices if the adjustment map, or rather self-persuasion map, is currently highly mean regressive and raise prices if the self-persuasion map is currently not highly mean regressive. It says adjustment map, but it should say self-persuasion map. Okay. All right, now just real quickly, there are also some weights here. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Let me back up here. So yeah, so this is the most mean regressive. Now I call this the mean regressive map because notice how the curves converge very strongly. So a consumer who's very indifferent through self-persuasion is going to find herself much closer to the preferences of somebody who previous to self-persuasion had been very strongly preferenced. So there's a person over here and a person over here. Before self-persuasion are pretty far apart in the product. As they continue to self-persuade, they get closer and closer. Their opinions are more concentrated because, and this is because the indifferent consumer is better at self-persuasion than the strongly preferenced consumer under that regime. So I call that mean regressive, and this is less mean regressive under this map. Given the parameterization, this consumer, the strongly preferenced consumer, starts with relatively lower self-persuasion costs, so there's going to be less conversions. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to go quickly through these two other slides. Remember that there are also weights here, T minus B and B over T times theta. So the relative sizes of these two effects, the shaping effect and manifestation effect, is also affected by these weights. Okay, so both of these weights are going to be large if B is small relative to T. Okay, what does that mean that B is small relative to T? That means that you're going to have a baseline self-persuasion cost low relative to T. So just backing up to here, okay, so for this map, so if the self-persuasion cost starts at a level that's pretty close to T, then B is actually pretty close to T. Okay, B represents the level of this initially. If it was much lower, then B would be much lower than T, and you'd have a lot of self-persuasion, even pre-advertising. Okay, so what B relative to T represents is the amount of self-persuasion that consumers do pre-advertising. Okay, so and so that's what it says here. A greater amount of pre-existing self-persuasion means more sizable pre-existing effects for advertising to shape, and therefore the shaping effect dominates. So when we see T large relative to B, this effect is going to dominate because the consumers, even without advertising, are doing a lot of self-persuasion. So the map is relatively prominent, and therefore we're going to have a lot of effects for advertising to shape. If, on the other hand, pre-existing self-persuasion is relatively unimportant compared to self-persuasion engendered through advertising, then the manifestation effect dominates. Okay. And I'm just going to, not spend much time on this, but also the size of this T squared minus BT over B is also related to the size of B relative to T, and it also influences the relative size of the manifestation effect relative to the shaping effect in the same direction as we just spoke about. Okay. All right. So that's the model and its implication for prices. So why does this how does this affect? How is this empirically relevant? Okay, remember I mentioned that there's been recent empirical work that has assumed that what advertising does is it increases the willingness to pay of targeted consumers, and that's it. That's how it works. Okay, so an essential contribution of this model is to show that advertising's price effects also depend upon the latent pattern of self-persuasion. They depend upon something else. So what are the implications of my model for that existing empirical work? Well, as a case study of this, I want to talk about a paper by Tulin Erdem and some co-authors. I think people here probably know Tulin. She's at NYU. But she has a 2008 paper with some co-authors in which they estimated demand systems using conditional indirect utility so as to measure advertising's effect on the entire demand curve. Now, this was a fairly innovative technique. Previously, it had been assumed that advertising shifts the demand curve, just shifts it, right? So you're going to shift demand to the right by advertising. And she said, well, no, it's a little bit more subtle than that. You could be rotating the demand curve. So let's estimate that, all right? And so their method allowed them to determine whether advertising raises the willingness to pay of marginal or inframarginal consumers, okay? Whether it rotates the demand curve. But the problem is that the self-persuasion framework shows their model to be a reduced form. So their measurements, which they had believed show the effect of just one kind of effect that advertising has, since there are two effects that advertising has, their measurements confound those two effects. And so we can't back out the advertising strategy from the observed price effects. We cannot take a look at the estimates of the model and figure out whether marginal or inframarginal consumers were targeted. And conversely, we cannot predict the price effects of any given advertising strategy. Okay, so let me just give you a flavor of why this is the case. So the model that Erdem et al. Estimate is essentially the one that you see here, okay? So they're estimating their dependent variables, the indirect utility of the consumer conditional on choice of brand. Okay, it's the conditional utility of the consumer conditional on the choice of the brand. They say it's a function of price, or they estimate it as a function of price, of advertising expenditures for the brand, some other variables. Okay, so let's let U tilde represent the consumer's utility from her best outside option, and assume that all variables other than alpha I and epsilon I are homogeneous across brands. Then the consumer prefers brand I if and only if this expression holds. And this implies that the consumer's willingness to pay for the brand is represented by this expression where the denominator is strictly positive. Okay, so we can take this willingness to pay and we can see how advertising affects it by differentiating the expression, and we get this expression here. All right, so now this is a critical expression in Erdem et al.'s framework. And what you can see is that there's this coefficient gamma PA, which is the coefficient on the interactive term of price and advertising. And so they recognize that this first term here is going to be negative, but depending upon the sign of this alpha PA, we could have the effect of advertising on inframarginal consumers be greater than for marginal consumers, so that certain consumers' willingness to pay is being influenced more than others. And in fact, they argue that the presumptive case is where that coefficient is negative, and that what that would suggest is targeting of marginal consumers, advertising that would, if you're increasing the willingness to pay, just imagine a demand curve, if you're increasing the willingness to pay of the marginal consumer with the lowest willingness to pay, what you're doing in effect is flattening the demand curve. And that kind of advertising, they argue, will lower prices. It'll make demand more elastic. So even though you're increasing some consumers' willingness to pay, you're actually making demand more elastic. So they estimate their model for 18 brands, and they find for 17 out of 18 brands that gamma PA is less than 0. They say, look, almost all advertising is targeting the marginal consumer, and so we should expect advertising almost all the time to reduce prices. But the self-persuasion model shows that you can infer the targeting of marginal consumers from their estimates. Yes, it is possible that their estimated parameter could follow from these parameters in my model, which do suggest targeting of a marginal consumer. But they could alternatively follow from other parameter values. And therefore, the observed presumptive case could be generated despite advertisers actually targeting inframarginal consumers. We don't know which consumers were targeted by looking at their results. Conversely, we cannot predict on the basis of Erdem et al. Whether targeting advertising predominantly towards marginal consumers would even result in lower prices. Higher prices could result under the marginal targeting case if certain parameter values obtained in my model, but I'm sorry. Well, I actually so lower prices could result for certain parameter, but also higher prices could result. For these parameter values in my model, you could actually have consumers, marginal consumers being targeted, and actually higher prices resulting from that. Okay. So Erdem et al.'s result fails to provide empirical support, and I didn't mention this, so I'll mention this in passing. So one of the things that Erdem et al. Talk about in their papers, they talk about Becker and Murphy's famous advertising paper, 1993 paper, Gary Becker and Kevin Murphy, in which they say their prediction is that advertising is predominantly going to reduce prices because it's going to flatten the demand curve. So one of the purposes Erdem et al. Had was like, hey, let's go ahead and see if we can estimate this, see if we can show this is the case. So Erdem et al. Failed to show that this is the case. And so actually, this assertion by Becker and Murphy is as yet unproven, if you believe my model. conclusion, the paper offers a new conception of persuasive advertising. It's distinct from conventional informative advertising, and it has an efficient purpose, okay? It helps the consumer to self-persuade. Now, it arises because we assume that consumers actually want to be persuaded. They're motivated to alter their preferences. And when rational consumers desire to like their choices more, it's possible to conceive of how persuasion might influence them, and consumers may actually value being persuaded. The new theory provides important implications for empirical efforts to predict price levels on the basis of advertising strategies. Now, I want to say, actually, I want to highlight this slide importantly. So you may say, okay, so I'm not so sure I believe your theory that consumers are self-persuading. I don't know if I believe that consumers actually do this, all right? So what if I don't believe that? What if I think advertising is still influencing a relatively inert consumer and convincing that consumer to like the product more? Well, even if we do not accept that advertising works by facilitating self-persuasion, the model's results still hold if we, number one, accept that different consumers have different marginal reactivity to advertising, okay? So maybe consumers don't uniformly react to advertising. Maybe they have different reactivities to advertising, and this reactivity varies systematically with the intensity of initial preference, okay? Here, the T minus B in my model could represent the installed base of consumer response to external stimuli supporting the product, such as past advertising. And in this case, the college savings program analogy applies intuitively to this alternative interpretation of my model. The alternative interpretation of the model merely abstracts from the presumption that consumers are actively engaged in trying to persuade themselves, okay? Otherwise, the effects are the same. The two competing models are empirically identical, and we should have the same concerns about empirical work that posits that advertising merely increases consumers' willingness to pay. Okay, so it doesn't all depend upon this self-persuasion idea, okay? All right, so the work suggests that we need new empirical approaches to estimating the price effects of advertising. Okay, simply looking at observational data on advertising and measuring its effects on consumer choice are not sufficient. One possibility is advertising field experiments. We could use a scanner panel similar to Erdem et al., but add to this randomly assigned treatments. Okay, so a randomly assigned treatment group that is exposed to brand advertising and a control group that's not. In this context, we can measure purchases, prices, and exposures and relative correlates over time. And these measurements then make it possible to identify and control for my manifestation effect. And then this could form the basis for predictions of price effects resulting from ad campaigns targeted in different ways. And the effects would be measured, therefore, relative to the initially estimated baseline. And you would actually have a robust estimation of the effects of advertising price. So that's it. That's my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.